Hello all, welcome back. Once again, we're going to continue on now with more of the cranial bones, and we only have two left. We have the ethmoid and temporal bones, and then we also need to talk about the sutures, those joints between cranial bones, and we also need to talk about some features on the skull of a fetus called the fontanelles. And so I'm actually going to divide this up into a little bit shorter tidbits so you don't have to sit through a longer discussion. Actually, the skull takes the longest time to go through when you're doing skeletal anatomy because it's the most tedious. The bones are the most complex and difficult to visualize, and they have a number of different important features on them. All right, so we said the next one we were going to do is the ethmoid bone, and kind of like how the sphenoid bone was kind of complicated in shape and located deep inside the skull there, same deal with the ethmoid bone. So in order for you to see that, I'm actually going to click on part of it out here. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So in blue, if I kind of rotate the skull up like this, you're getting a little bit of a inferior view. Looking up into the roof there of the nasal cavity on the inside, everything you see there highlighted in blue is all part of the ethmoid bone. So you can see this is a kind of a complex, complicated bone. It's got a very wavy structure there on that poor inside of the nasal cavity. Then also, if you're looking in your orbital cavities, you see how on the medial wall of each orbital cavity, deep inside there on the medial wall, back in the back, posterior portion, that's also part of the ethmoid bone as well. So remember how I said if you took your fingers and you stuck them into your orbital cavities and spread them out laterally, you would be touching the greater wings of the sphenoid bone? If you pinched them like this, back in the back, you would be contacting a portion of the ethmoid bone. So let me deselect that for a second, because to see the ethmoid bone in more detail, we're going to need to break open our skull here, look inside, rotate it back like that, and move it down. All right, and hopefully you remember this is bone right here that kind of looks like a bat is the sphenoid bone. And let me click on that. Everything that I've highlighted there in blue, that is part of the ethmoid bone, and actually so is that, and so is that on each side. All of that, ethmoid bone. So if we kind of rotate it around, you can see it in more detail. All right, and then let me deselect that for a second. I'm going to get rid of these bones as well. Hide those for a second. And let me light the ethmoid bone back up for you again. And that'll give you another perspective on how this bone is sitting there inside the skull. More or less has kind of a cube shape to it, as you can see there. That's the ethmoid bone. All right, let me refresh my view, bring everything back. We're going to kind of start over there with the ethmoid bone so we can talk about its features. All right, I'm going to get rid of the frontal bone of the skull, rotate this back around so that we can see it. All right, so here on the, all right, so right in here, everything that I'm kind of circling there with the cursor, you are looking at the top portion of the ethmoid bone. Everything that you see there, let me highlight it again for you. Everything you see there, ethmoid bone. All right, if I kind of rotate it back this way and laterally, move it down, I kind of zoom in. Do you see right in here, get my pen up, see that pointy feature you have right there? Oops, I've got the eraser on, that doesn't work. That pointy feature you've got right there, that is called the crista galli. So that is a feature on the ethmoid bone. That is a feature. Now, where you see really prominent, thick features on bones, you're going to learn as we go through the Unit 3 physiology that bones tend to thicken and expand and grow at locations where things are pulling on them or are attached to them. So for example, where your skeletal muscles have tendons on them that attach to your bones. And so when you move, you use your skeletal muscles. When they contract, they pull on your bones. Those tendons that are attached to the muscles are pulling on those bones, and the locations at which the tendons pull on them, the bone tends to thicken at that location. It becomes more prominent. So wherever you see these little projections and so forth, and bumps and thicker areas, that's because you have things attached at that location. The crista galli is the point of location for the meninges. And the meninges are connective tissue coverings that you have around the brain and the spinal cord. So the crista galli is where those are really anchored. They're within the cranial cavity, and there are 3 different layers to the meninges. You'll learn about those in Unit 5, but one of them is super tough. If you actually got to do a dissection of a human brain or some other type of mammal, you would be amazed at how tough that covering is. And that's where it's attached. The crista galli is also the feature of the skull where if somebody does an uppercut like that on the chin, it can be lethal because the crista galli, that pointy structure there, can actually poke into that portion of the brain, and that can actually be fatal in some circumstances. Aren't you glad I'm passing along that kind of useful, violent information to you? All right, other features on the ethmoid bone. Let me zoom back out. Rotate my skull back around this way. All right, we're kind of zoomed in there. Move it over. Let me get my pen back up. All right, do you see how you've got kind of a square area? All right, so there's the crista galli right there. That's crista galli. That little square area that you've got right in there, that is your cribriform plate. And you see how you've got little holes? You might be able to see that. I don't know if you can see that on the YouTube video or not. There are teeny tiny holes all within that cribriform plate, and those are openings for branches of your olfactory nerves. Those are olfactory nerve openings. Does olfactory remind you anything? Those are the nerves that are responsible for your sense of smell. And your olfactory nerves are also a pair of your cranial nerves that extend off of the brain stem. And so they have little branches that go through there, and guess where they end up? They end up in the roof of your nasal cavity. In fact, let me zoom out again for a second, because if we go back in here and look inside the nasal cavity, I'm not sure how great of a view we'll get, but if you went way down deep inside there, back in here, that would be the underside of the cribriform plate in there. So those little nerve endings are dangling down through there, and they're responsible for your sense of smell, kind of deep down inside there. All right, so that's cribriform plate. Perpendicular plate. I should have left things where they were. All right. Let me zoom back out for a second. I'm actually going to deselect the ethmoid bone for a second, because I'm going to click on this. This is called the perpendicular plate, and it is actually part of the ethmoid bone. Invisible Body is just allowing me to select that independently of the rest of the ethmoid bone. So you can kind of see where that's located. So that is a portion of the bony division that separates the 2 sides of the nasal cavity, the left and the right. And it runs in a perpendicular direction down the center there of the nasal cavities. That's called the perpendicular plate. It's flat like a plate. That's where it gets its name. And there I'm highlighting the rest of the ethmoid bone for you so that you can see it. All right. The next one, superior and middle nasal conchae. So if you're following along in your lab guide, let me get back out of that for a second. I'm going to change my view. All right, looking up into the nasal cavity here, deep into the nose. Do you see how you have a fold right there and over there? Those are your middle nasal conchae, or some people say conchae. AE on the end, those are Latin words, and the CH is pronounced with a K. You'll run across that quite a bit in your biology courses as well. Those are conchae. And you've got one on each side. Each of those are the middle nasal conchae. Do you see down here how you've got a curved bone there and over there as well? Each of those is an inferior nasal conchae or conchae, but those are actually classified as separate bones. They're not part of the ethmoid bone. They are actually their own little bone sitting down there in the inferior portion of the nasal cavity. They're also officially classified as facial bones rather than cranial bones of the skull. All right, so why do you have these curved bony features inside there? It's thought that they play an important role, so when you breathe in air, those bones are also called turbinate bones, or your turbinates. It's not writing too well. They're called turbinates or turbinate bones. So if you think about a turbine that spins, it's thought that as you breathe in air, the air circulates around those folds that you have back in there in the nasal cavity. Now, they're pretty far back in there. So don't try to jab your finger up into your nasal cavity and feel the turbinates. That would probably be pretty painful. But it's thought that as you breathe in air, it kind of swirls around and circulates in there, and that way, if you're breathing cold air outside, it has a chance to warm up there along the nice, warm, juicy mucous membrane in your nasal cavity before it starts traveling down toward your lungs, which could potentially damage your lungs if it was cold enough. It also gives, by swirling the air around in there, it provides time for the mucus that's located there along the surface of that epithelial lining you have in the nasal cavity to trap dust and microorganisms, things like that you're breathing in. And that's what makes your boogers. That's why you have lots of boogers in your nose, from all that dust and other things that are being trapped there by the mucus. All right, that's those two. Now I know on your study guide you have listed superior nasal conchae, and those are way back in deep. They are features, they're little curved features that hang off of the roof of the ethmoid bone. But they're not modeled very well on visible body. They're actually not modeled on our pretend skulls that we have in the anatomy labs here at Calhoun. So apparently they're difficult to visualize and they're fairly small. So if I asked you, if I had an arrow pointing toward the inside roof of the nasal cavity and said, what are the most superior folds that you have here, you would know that I'm talking about the superior nasal conchae. And they're deep, deep, deep inside there, but you can't really see them with visible body here. All right, last feature for the ethmoid bone, ethmoid sinuses. All right, so this is just more or less kind of like what we heard with the sphenoid bone and the frontal bone, although visible body actually has modeled them for you fairly well. Do you see how they have actual openings right in there and right in there? So you have spaces down inside there. Those spaces deep inside the bone are the ethmoid sinuses. All right, and again, sinus is a mucous membrane lined compartment inside a bone that is open. It does have openings into the nasal cavity. So those sinuses in there can become congested at times, if you have a sinus infection or you're having problems with allergies. And apparently those are the sinuses where if you get this pressure and you just want to squeeze like this, it's just where your ethmoid bone is back in there behind in the posterior sections of your orbital cavities back in there. That's where you would feel that intense pressure and pain where you just want to squeeze your eyeballs out because it's bothering you so much. That's usually from your ethmoid sinuses. So again, on an exam, I would likely, if you see an arrow pointing toward the ethmoid bone and I'm asking you about the compartments on the inside, those are going to be your ethmoid sinuses. If you know the bone, you know the name of the sinuses. That's pretty straightforward and easy. All right, I'm actually going to stop this video here. Then we'll go on to the temporal bone, which also has a number of features, and then I will do another separate clip on the sutures and the fontanelle features of the fetal skull that you need to know.